start back from the beginning. I met the Lord as a young person in my small village in the state of Iowa through my home church. And then later I met the Navigators in 1964 when I was a student at a Christian college in East Texas called Laterno College. And while I was there, I met Denny Repko. He was on Navigator staff living in Dallas, Texas. And Denny knew my wife from before. And so Denny drove over to visit me one day in Longview, Texas, where we were living. And Denny asked me to share my testimony, which I did. But I told him, Denny, I've never ever learned to share my faith with people in a way that I felt like I really connected. And so Denny said, well, look, I'll take you out and show you how. So we went out on a college campus in East Texas, and we just walked into the dormitories, started talking to people about Jesus, and Denny asked us, we went into the room of a young man, and he said, can I show you an illustration of what it means to be, how you become a Christian? And so Denny shared the bridge illustration with this young guy. And right there, while we're sitting talking, that young man prayed to receive Christ, invite Christ into his heart. And when I saw that happen, I was recruited right there. I had never had anyone tell me personally, follow me and I'll make you a fisher of men. But I met Denny. He showed me how to share my faith, and he began to disciple me. And so that was the beginning, 1964, when I first met the Navigators. So then later on, through various training experiences and through different ministry encounters with the Navigators, my wife and I, Margaret, were asked to go to Norway as missionaries with the Navigators, working with students. So we moved to Norway in 1969, and we had, of course, to learn the language, and we ministered in Norway for 7 years. And one of the special experiences, we started a student ministry in the city of Trondheim, Norway, and one of the students we met was a man named Geir Dolman. And Geir Dolman became a Christian in our ministry in Trondheim. And 7 years later from the time he became a Christian, he was sent to Kenya as an international trainee, what we called back then ITs. And when we moved to Kenya, he met us at the airport. He was here as a missionary with the Navigators. Anyway, just to back up, so we're living in Norway. One day I received a phone call from Doug Sparks, who was the director of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, based in England. And Doug said, I'm making a trip down to Kenya. It was in 1975. So he asked me if I could go with him on this trip to Kenya. And Noel Nelson was here as the country leader. And so I came to Kenya in 1975 for a 2-week visit. And during that time, I still remember Per-Olof and Lena Edstrom were here from Sweden, and Ova and Anna-Marie Tingard were here. They were here. He came to pioneer this high school work. Anyway, Per-Olof and I went to Kenyatta University, and there we met a young university student named Mutwa Mahini. And we went into his dormitory, and I still remember meeting him, and he had been discipled in the high school work, and he had his verse pack there in his bookcase. So that was 1975. So that was our first visit to Kenya, and then later we found out there was an opportunity for us to come back and serve as the country leader for Kenya, and we moved here in 1977 of June. So that was when we officially moved here. My wife and I and our 3 daughters, Sherry, Kristen, and Sonia. And Sherry was 13, Kristen was 8, and Sonia was 6. So that was the beginning of our time in Kenya. The ministry at that time, of course, it was very, very small. We had a ministry at University of Nairobi and Kenyatta University, those 2 places. And then the first missionary here to start the student work, his name was Jim White, Jim and Jerry White. And one of the things they discovered was that because we first started working with students at the university, and they discovered at that time the university was just 3 years. 3 years was not adequate time for the Navigators to get the kind of depth that we wanted in the disciples. So as they were talking and praying, the thought came up to start a ministry in high schools in Kenya so that we could do initial discipling, evangelism, and establishing in the high schools, and then follow these high school students into university and continue discipling them there, equipping them to become laborers. And so that's what we found when we were here. The promise that my wife and I had claimed over the years was Isaiah 58, 10 through 12. That verse says, if you draw out your soul to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then the Lord will guide you continually, it says. He will satisfy your soul in drought. He will make fat your bones, and you'll be like a watered garden and like a spring of waters whose waters fail not. So, and then verse 12 talks about those from among you. In other words, the people that will be raised up, they will repeople or replenish the ancient cities. And so that was one of the promises. Another promise was Isaiah 60:22. A little one shall become 1,000, a small one a mighty nation. I, the Lord, will hasten it in my time. So those were 2 of the foundational promises that we were claiming at that time. And part of our original strategy was that we would focus on young people coming out of the university, high schools, that these people would eventually become the leaders of the nation. So our ministry at that time was very much toward the educated. We didn't really have any ministry working with the poor or even working in rural villages. What we knew at that time was student ministry. So that's where we first started, laying the foundation with the future leaders that would become leaders in the nation of Kenya. You know, because Kenya has always been a country very open to having missionaries come in, and open generally to the gospel. You know, it's not what we call a restricted country or a closed country. So from the very get-go, I envisioned that we wanted to have full-time staff. We wanted to have people who could give their full attention and time to making disciples. And in the Navigators, of course, we know that we want to see some full-time staff, and we want to see hundreds of people who are laboring in the marketplace. But my vision was very much focused on raising up Kenyan leaders who would come full-time with the Navigators. That was very much part of our foundational vision, because that's what, at that time, that's what the Navigators had done, primarily students, and also, of course, in the military ministry in other parts of the world, but not so much in military here in Africa. One of the highlights in I think it was 1982, God gave us the idea to launch an evangelistic mission called Operation Joshua. Operation Joshua. And so we took about 50 university students that we committed themselves to be involved with us, and we developed a multimedia production, and we were going to go throughout the whole country of Kenya preaching the gospel in high schools. So these university students then were in training with us, learning how to share the gospel, but we used a multimedia production. But just a quick little story. I had been in touch with an organization that promised to fund Operation Joshua. It was going to cost us $10,000. This is 1982, which is a lot of money. But we were giving the students a small stipend, and that traveling costs, and etc. The whole budget was $10,000. There was an organization that promised to give us that money to fund that. 1 month before Operation Joshua was going to start, I got a letter in the mail saying, "Oh, we're sorry. Our funds have dried up. We can't help you with Operation Joshua." 1 month. The students, we'd already recruited these students to be involved. In fact, they were out at Word of Life camp in Kibete, and were in training, and here we were with no money. Now, God did a miracle. God did a real miracle. I got a call one day from a friend of mine who used to live here in Nairobi. He was then working with the Samaritan's Purse, which is the organization directed by Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham. These men asked if they could have an appointment with me, and said that, so we met at a restaurant downtown Nairobi. And so Franklin Graham asked me, he says, "Well, Bruce," he said, "tell me what's God doing in the Navigators here in Kenya?" And so I told him about Operation Joshua, and I told him that we had no money. And right there in that conversation while we're talking, Franklin Graham took his checkbook out of his pocket and wrote me a check, wrote the Kenyan Navigator check for $5,000 US. This is 1982. That's like 50,000 today. So there we had half of it. 1 week later, I get a telegram from England, from a navigator in England who was part of a foundation in England. He heard about Operation Joshua, and he said, "We will fund the balance of Operation Joshua, the other $55,000. So in 1 week, from sources we had no idea where it was coming from, God provided the $10,000, which funded Operation Joshua. And that year, as the teams went out, we saw 439 students come to Christ. 439. And you know, all the different schools where we had presented the gospel. And I think it's Thomas Ndigi, who became a Christian down in Mombasa through Operation Joshua. He's been part of the Navigators for years and years. And so that, let me just say this, that in the Navigator ministry, we work one-on-one, we work in small groups, and that's the heart and core of what we do. But what I've learned, and through that experience with Operation Joshua, that from time to time we need to have an evangelistic outreach where we mobilize people to get involved in something bigger than what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. Because the Bible says, Hebrews 11:6, without faith, it's impossible to believe God. And so faith and evangelism, like a friend of mine said, he said, if we don't evangelize, we will fossilize. and so evangelism becomes the energy. That's where we create faith, and people get excited because they see the gospel penetrating. And so one of the things I've learned over the years, that every Navigator movement, from time to time, we need to inject it with some kind of broader evangelistic outreach to supplement and to encourage people who are doing this on a day-to-day basis. People tend to get discouraged. They get to they kind of wind down and they lose their. But when we come together in a larger group and we inspire people with faith and courage and the promises of God, so that was one of the major lessons we learned during that time. That evangelism needs to be on the cutting edge of discipling. When we stop doing evangelism, the ministry slows down. Now, it's true that our expertise as navigators is in discipling. But as Jesus gave us in the Great Commission, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. So discipling only happens after we've done good evangelism. And we don't do evangelism, the discipling process tends to dry up. And so that's one of the lessons we learned. Yeah, it was a big one. As I mentioned earlier, my vision was that I was going to believe God for a full-time staff. So the question that kept me awake at night, we missionaries, we had our support coming from the countries like in Sweden, Denmark, and in my case in the U.S. So I'm thinking, how are our Kenyan staff, how are they going to do what we did as missionaries without the resources that we had? And many missionaries forget that they've got this organization behind them that's helping administrative work, helping receive their money and income, providing health insurance or retirement programs and so on. So they support their staff. And I thought, we need the same thing in Kenya. If we want to see people laboring for a lifetime, we need to figure out how to help fund them. And so, yeah, the concept of individual people raising support, that was a huge challenge, an enormous challenge. Because typically you sign up with an organization, they pay you a salary. But in the Navigators case, we asked people to raise their support. And that first generation, the first two ladies that came on staff was Sarah Mutua and Esther Wariro. And so, and then the next three people in 1981, Mutua, Mayini, Dennis Tangoy, and Nick Wanyoika, they all came on staff in 1981. So we gave them some initial training. But again, my point is that because the concept was so new, I thought it's going to take all the money we can possibly raise just to fund the staff, So then God gave the idea of if we could trust him for a piece of property where we could have part of it would be our office and part of it would be rental property where we could rent out buildings that would generate cash flow that would provide the salaries for our office staff and cover the costs of our administrative overheads. So that was the initial idea. And I can still remember, Charles, to this day, driving down that driveway, I met a guy, a realtor here in Nairobi that I had contact with and told him what kind of property we were looking for. I met him up in Gong Road at a petrol station, and then he said, follow me, and we drove down that driveway. This was 1981. We came back in here, and this little office block was here, 2-story, and the big white house and a guest house, and then that swimming pool was in there. And my eyes bugged out of my head, I thought, could we possibly believe God to give us this property? It just seemed like it was too big. That was the beginning of the story. And it's a long, basically how it started was that Nick Wanyoika and I, we made a trip to the U.S. in '81, and we, were contacting different donors and friends back there that could possibly give this project. But one other thing that perhaps even more important than that, because of our experience in other places that one of the things that missionaries struggle with is that we tend to do things on our own instead of getting the local people, the national people, to own the mission, the purpose. So the beauty of what we did here was the little Kenyan team we had was a small little team, and we were needing 2.5 million shillings to buy this property. Now that doesn't sound like very much today. You can't even buy a flat for 2.5 million. But that was in its time, because the Kenyan shilling was 10 to 1. Today it's 100 to 1. So we thought, but anyway, so our little team, we came together, we prayed, said, what does God want us to do locally as a team? And the Kenyan Navigators, they were basically just students, we were students. Said, we want to trust God for 100,000 shillings. And that, at that time, that was like 10,000 US dollars. This is 1981. But the team owned the dream. It was our dream. It wasn't my dream. I might have been the person that was kind of initiating and leading it, but it was owned by the Navigator team. And that, I think that's been one of the blessings. And, it's a long story to how God brought it all together, provided all the funds. And then the thing, I can just share this, that as a missionary and someone who was, involved in trusting God for this property, the Kenyan Navigators have done an amazing job at stewarding and developing this resource. Mutu Mahini built the 2 apartments on top of the guest house. Paul Kimani put the 3rd story on the office building. Stanley McCallway, built the 6-story office block in the back. So the thing that's given me so much joy is that God gave us all the team, and they stewarded it, they managed it, and they developed it, and they grew it. And today, 40 years later, here we see what it is. They didn't run it down and destroy it like often what happens, but they developed it and maintained it and grew it. And to God be the glory for that. But I am so thankful for the Kenyan Navigators and the leadership they have demonstrated in expanding and growing this facility, because it produces the income to help grow this ministry all over the country of Kenya. All I can say is that they had a passion to know Jesus, and they had a passion to use their lives to spread the gospel and make disciples. I think maybe one of the other things, they were very deeply committed to the purposes of God. Because I began to understand after living here a while, if you're a university graduate in this country, you have the top salary jobs. But these people, when I say these people, I'm talking about Auntie Sarah and Esther and Dennis, Nick, and Mutwa. They gave up these high-paying jobs to come and serve with the Navigators with no guarantee of a salary. Now that is faith. That is enormous faith. And I often tell my friends, it takes more faith living in Kenya to believe God than it does for me living in America. I've been with the Navigators 54 years. And my entire 54 years, we have lived from gift income from people who support us. But supporting missionaries in Kenya, in the U.S., is part of our culture, our Christian culture. Whereas supporting missionaries here, especially the way we do it, having people raise their own support, that was a foreign concept, very foreign concept. So you ask about what kind of people were these? They were people that were strong in faith. They were willing to pay a sacrifice to advance the gospel. And I'm sure in many cases, the other thing was that their families maybe misunderstood because as you well know, in Kenya, if you get educated, you're expected to help provide for your siblings and your parents. And I think that generation, they certainly were responsible, and they did probably help provide. But it was a huge sacrifice. So you had people who were very, very deeply committed to the purposes of God and to the vision of making disciples. Because it was such a new concept. But let me just mention also, one of the errors, if I could say that, that missionaries committed. When you come to Africa from the U.S. and Europe, and you feel like you have more resources than the people you're trying to minister to, and so the error that missionaries committed, I'm talking about from years gone by, they did not teach the people they were discipling to give. As you know, the Bible's full of promises and challenges to give. 2 Corinthians 9:7, give and it shall be given unto you. Pressed down, shaken together, and running over, with the same measure that you measure shall be measured to you again. So missionaries would bring stuff and give it and give it and give it. But they didn't teach people that giving is part and parcel of being a disciple of Jesus. Jesus had more to say about money than almost anything. So it was a long, slow process, but we started even with our high school ministry. We started teaching people to give. And just like Jesus, when the woman gave the widow's mite, she gave, and he says, she's given more than the person who gave the big gifts. So it was a long, slow process. And even today, it's, you talk with the staff here, it's always a challenge, but we're seeing it happen. And it comes by teaching people what the scriptures say about this importance of giving. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Giving is part and parcel of the Christian life. That's what we taught these students. Well, let me just say, one of the encouraging things is that people in Kenya respond to the gospel. So, and I had ministered before in Norway, where Norway is very secular. It's almost post-Christian. People generally don't go to church there very much. So Kenya was refreshing in that sense. To people responded to the gospel. However, it was still challenging. It's always been a challenge to get people to say, I'm saved, praise the Lord, hallelujah, to get them to be disciples, to read the Bible, to study the Bible, to share, in other words, the disciplines that we train people in. That was challenging. And, but, just like Jesus poured his life into the 12 disciples, we found people responded. People were hungry. There's an organization here called Youth for Christ, and they were working in the high schools, and they were seeing many, many people come to Christ. So they came to the Navigators asking us to disciple all these people that were coming to Christ. So there was a time where we were spending all our time discipling people who had become Christians in other organizations, because that was our expertise. However, we learned that evangelism is what I mentioned earlier. Evangelism is part of becoming a disciple. So we had to make a little shift there in making sure we kept the cutting edge in evangelism. And so challenges that we found, the financial thing was a big one, and we've talked about that. And but other than that, I find the Kenyan people are easy to love. They're very friendly. They're very warm. They're very hospitable. So there weren't challenges that were overwhelming. Like When you're in Europe, people are negative. People are, they're very skeptical and doubtful and all that. We didn't have that problem here. Praise God. Obviously, it is faith. Again, without faith, it's impossible to please God. When I was here as a missionary, there's so many different opportunities you can do. But in my mind and in my heart, I kept telling myself, one day I'm going to get on the airplane and I'm going to leave this country. I knew I would not be here the rest of my life. I didn't know how long it would take, but so I had to say no to many different opportunities. I even had missionaries come and ask me if I could disciple them because they were missionaries here but didn't know what to do. Other missionaries. And I thought, well, that wasn't why I came to Kenya. I didn't some disciple missionaries. I came to disciple Kenyans. And so again, the question, Bruce, someday you're going to get on the airplane and you're going to leave. Now, how long, if you do not build into depth in these generations of people, how long is this vision going to last? How long is it going to perpetuate? Now, obviously, we didn't know. I mean, we saw this team, and they were great people. They were committed. They were, growing in leadership, growing in discipleship, commitment. And so we met as a committee, and we talked what kind of people we're looking for what kind of a person. And we looked at the leaders that we had, and as we sought the Lord laid his hand of blessing on Mutwa. And in fact, it was right here in this garden, right here, right where we have a parking lot in 1986. I think it was October. Mutwa Mahini was appointed as the first Kenyan national director. And we had the international president of the Navigators came out, Dr. Jerry White. We had people from other Christian organizations were here. Reverend John Gachinga, he was pastor in Nairobi Baptist at the time. So, it was by faith, but that generation of people, they demonstrated their hearts were in it. I mean, Mutwa, for example, he had a master's degree in French. Mutwa had the invitation from University of Nairobi to teach in the French department. Now, with that, they would give him a house, they would give him a car, they would, give him a salary. So here we come along as the Navigators. We offer Mutwa nothing. Go raise your support. And so, I mean, only God can move people to give up and surrender. And all of our leaders at that time were university graduates. They made a huge, enormous sacrifice, enormous. But God, I tell you, except a corn of wheat fall to the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it dies, and those people died, Mutwa Mahini, he died when he said no to the high position teaching at university, etc., etc., etc. That's falling into the ground and dying. But from his faith and the faith of the first generations, this work has continued to grow and develop and expand. And now when I come back here 40 years later, it blows my mind, to see what God is doing in the rural areas, amongst the poor people, etc., etc. When I left Kenya, we were in Nairobi. And a work in Eldoret had started. That was it. Eldoret and Nairobi. And one guy used to say to us, "When are you Navigators going to get out of Nairobi?" But now, it's sort of like when we missionaries got out of the way, then the Kenyans took the work and grew it and expanded, and before we knew it, They were in Mombasa and Machakos and Nakuru and all over the place. So it's been but that first generation paid an enormous price. They really did. You know, we have different kinds of training programs in the Navigators where you can come on staff for 2 years. In fact, we started that during the time we were here to give people a chance to see, is God calling me into this ministry? Now, your question basically highlights the question, how do I determine the call of God on my life for full-time ministry? It's not an easy question. And I would also say it's not a formula. Do this, do this, do this. But at the foundation of it, it has to do with you seeking the Lord. Like the Apostle Paul, when he met Christ on the road to Damascus, he asked 2 questions. He said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the second question was, "What do you want me to do?" And so as a young person joining staff in the Navigators today, I love that 2-year training program. You maybe call it something different today, I don't know. But you get a taste of whether or not God is calling you into this type of ministry. And how will you know that? You will know that in your heart. God will speak to you. And just like when God called Samuel, he said, "Here am I, Lord, speak to me." And so it's a personal thing. I remember as a young person myself, when I first began to get the call, I became a Christian very young in my life. And I was, trying to figure out what did I want to do, but when I got a taste of ministry and began to see God using me in people's lives, I knew that was what God was calling me to do. I was 19 years old when I experienced that. And so to young people today joining staff, I'll just say, give it your best. Give it all you've got. Get out there and get involved in the battle. Sharing the gospel with people, discipling people. And in your heart, you will know whether God is calling you to this full time. It's not more spiritual, let me emphasize, because we want hundreds of people to be involved in their professions, but we also want a few people to be called to full-time staff. One is not more important than the other. Both are necessary, but I think to keep this movement growing and developing, we must always have full-time staff. Yeah, it basically, it happened when, as we were watching people grow in their leadership of the ministry, I began to realize that, hey, these guys and girls, men and women, they've got this vision and they're running with it. And I think part of it was the Lord spoke to me and made it clear that your time is coming to an end. And then as a leadership, Mike Trenier was living here as the Africa director at that time. And we were all praying and seeking the Lord together. And we had a process that we went through in selecting the country leader. But I think it was basically realizing that God was raising up some very committed disciples, and I needed to get out of the way. and I've often thought, wow, if I'd have stayed around here, I would have slowed the whole thing down. Because when we moved back, and I say this graciously and with a great deal of admiration and thankfulness, but the Kenyans took this thing and they ran with it and did a whole lot more than I could have ever done. And how did I know? I think we knew because we saw men of stature men of faith, men of initiative, men of zeal. We're being raised. I keep saying men. I'm sorry. I need to include men and women because they were as much a part of it as the men were. And then the other thing was kind of neat was we saw many couples marry. Like we did premarital counseling with Dennis and Irene Tungoy. And we attended the weddings, of Nick and Flo Wanyoika and Mutua's wedding. And so there were lots of people getting married in those days. And they were marrying people from within the ministry. So the wives had been discipled and the men had been. And so that was another thing, part of my vision. I wanted to have a ministry where young men and women could meet each other in the ministry and grow up with shared values. Because sometimes, as we've seen in other countries, if the men get discipled, but the women don't get discipled, or vice versa, then when they marry, oftentimes, it's a struggle to bring the spouse along to really, so they're walking together with a mutual vision, committed vision. So that was another thing, part of my vision. I wanted to see men and women marry within the Navigators. Not that was only that, but I wanted to see that happen because when God calls a couple to ministry, if the husband is giving up his vocation, and the wife, oftentimes the wife worries more about things like that. Well, if she's not equally committed to the vision, then she'll start complaining, you're not helping supply my needs, and whereas if she knows that God has called them, then she's not complaining, but she's on the team with her husband, and really trusting God together with him. Yeah.